Years later, a group of friends decided to celebrate together and boarded a luxurious boat for the occasion. But as soon as they reached the sea, unexpected events began to unfold, causing some of them to fall into the water and struggle to climb back onto the boat. Things became even more dangerous when unknown creatures appeared in the water. This adventurous story starts by introducing several friends who were still unmarried at the time. They used to date each other casually, Amy with a boy named Dan, and Jack with a girl named Lauren. The four of them enjoyed exploring life together, but as time passed, their studies ended, and they became busy with their own lives. Now, years later, everyone had settled down. Amy, for instance, had married a man named James, and they had a lovely little daughter named Sarah. At this moment, Amy and James were driving toward Mexico to board a boat. The reason was that their friend Dan was celebrating his birthday. Interestingly, Dan had previously dated Amy, but James was completely unaware of this. Jack, another friend, had organized the luxurious boat for the party, and everyone headed toward the dock. Before boarding, they made sure all equipment was packed and prepared properly. Amy and James carefully took care of their young daughter, Sarah. However, Amy had a deep fear of water. She couldn't swim and often fainted when submerged due to a traumatic incident from years ago, when her sailor father tragically drowned. Since that day, she had avoided traveling by boat, but being with friends made her feel comfortable enough to board. James reassured her that they would have fun and that everything would be safe, putting her at ease. When all the friends finally arrived at Jack's luxurious yacht, they were shocked. Jack, who came from a middle-class background, somehow owned such an extravagant boat, which puzzled everyone. As they explored the lower deck, they noticed Jack having fun with a girl named Michelle. Everyone knew Jack's history of dating multiple girls. Years ago he had been with Lauren, and now he was with Michelle. Seeing this, it was clear Lauren had moved on. The friends left Jack behind for a moment and went to the upper deck, but soon Jack joined them, overjoyed to reconnect after so many years without contact. The reunion was filled with excitement and nostalgia. Amy and James, curious, asked Jack where he got such a luxurious boat, but Jack evaded the question with playful humor, hinting he was hiding something. Meanwhile, Amy and James took every precaution to ensure their daughter's safety, placing Sarah securely in the lower deck and setting up a walkie-talkie so they could communicate with her at all times. Once Sarah fell asleep, the adults moved to the upper deck to enjoy themselves. As before, the party was grand, full of celebration, and Amy even enjoyed a drink, reminiscing about their college days and the joyful memories they had shared. The friends were genuinely happy, reliving the moments that had brought them together years ago. But little did they know that a massive danger was waiting for them. As the party continued, Michelle approached Jack and whispered in his ear that they should jump into the water for fun. The water was so clear that everyone would enjoy swimming. Without hesitation, the excited friends dove in. On the boat, only Amy and Dan remained, former lovers, while James had also joined the others in the water, unaware of what was happening on the upper deck. Dan tried to convince Amy to join the group, but she explained her deep fear of water. This fear wasn't innate, it stemmed from the traumatic death of her father years ago. Since then, she had never dared step into the sea. Despite Dan's attempts to give her mental support, Amy had made it clear she didn't want to swim. The problem escalated when a reckless Dan forcefully lifted Amy and jumped into the water. Everyone watching assumed they were just having fun together, but the moment Amy hit the water, she lost consciousness, her body out of control, and memories of childhood experiences with her father in the sea flooded back. Dan panicked as Amy didn't respond, and slowly, James and the other friends reached them, trying to make her feel comfortable. The friends had no idea of the full danger, so they considered returning to the boat. The real problem was that Dan hadn't deployed a ladder or anchor when he jumped, meaning no one could climb back onto the tall luxury boat directly. The friends were now stranded in the middle of the sea with no land in sight, and the height of the boat made it impossible to return. Only Amy and James's little daughter, Sarah, remained safely on the boat, leaving her parents deeply worried. Jack, Dan, and Lauren tried various ways to get back on board, but every attempt failed. Lauren had a dolphin-shaped inflatable they could float on, which Dan and Jack tried to use to reach the boat, but their combined weight made it impossible. Panic spread among the friends as every minute in the water increased the danger. Dan then attempted to grab the flagpole on the boat to climb up. After several tries, he finally got a hold of it, but when Jack tried to pull him up, the flagpole snapped, ruining the plan. The only relief was that Amy regained consciousness and started feeling better. The group now had to urgently figure out a way to get back onto the boat, as they had already been in the water for several minutes without a solution. Suddenly, Michelle felt something under her feet and panicked, screaming that a shark was nearby. This terrified everyone and pushed them toward the boat. When Dan checked, there was no shark, likely Michelle's imagination, but the tension remained high. Their most important concern was Amy, because little Sarah was still on the boat, completely vulnerable. The good thing was that Sarah was asleep, because if she woke up, calming her would have been almost impossible. Everyone blamed Dan for the whole situation, as it had already been agreed that only one person should stay on the boat, but in his excitement to have fun with Amy, Dan had jumped into the water without thinking. He grew increasingly frustrated as all eyes turned on him, even though his only intention had been to enjoy time with his friends. Very few of them had life jackets, and Michelle didn't have one at all, which made her panic further, fearing she would be the first to drown. Exhausted, Michelle tried to snatch Amy's life jacket, but Dan and James intervened, protecting Amy. Lauren quickly reached Michelle and tried to calm her down, instructing her not to do anything reckless. Despite these efforts, everyone felt hopeless. In such situations, marine experts suggest that if you can't climb back on a luxury boat directly, you should look for a stern platform at the back of the boat, a place used for swimming or motorboating. If that doesn't work, a human ladder can be formed, where one person climbs on another to reach the boat. For example, if Dan and several friends were stranded, he could have lifted a lighter person like Lauren or Amy to push them up, with someone else supporting from the water. If this still fails, the boat's propeller guard could be used, but only if the engine is off, otherwise, it could be deadly. Another option is to use the small drain outlets as makeshift steps to climb back. Proper planning and coordination would allow them to get back safely, but panic had taken over, leaving everyone unable to think clearly. Jack, Dan, and the group were stranded in the water when suddenly a ringing sound came from the upper deck. Jack's coat, lying at the edge of the boat, had a phone inside. Dan immediately swam to grab it, and after some effort, he retrieved the wet phone, but it had already been damaged and the call disconnected, costing them a crucial chance to ask for help. Michelle panicked further, trying to grab the phone from Dan to establish a connection herself, which led to a heated confrontation. In frustration, Dan threw the phone into the water, sinking it for good. Dan then came up with a plan, using pieces of clothing from their bodies to make a rope that could be thrown onto the boat railing to climb back. Not everyone agreed, as it meant partially exposing themselves, but discussions continued. Just then, they noticed another boat passing nearby, and they waved and shouted for help. Unfortunately, the boat was filled with tourists who had seen them but could not stop in time to rescue them. The tourists, however, thought the group was simply playing in the water and waving happily, misinterpreting their distress signals as signs of fun. They moved ahead with their other boat, and the opportunity for rescue slipped away. Amy grew increasingly anxious, and the group had no choice but to adopt Dan's plan, removing clothing and tying them together to create a rope to climb back onto the boat. Jack produced a knife and began cutting the clothes into a long rope, though no one knew why he had it with him. Using the rope, Dan, Jack, and James attempted to throw it over the railing to climb up, but it eventually tore under their weight. Hours passed, their stamina dwindled, and with nothing to eat, their energy drained further. Experts suggest a survival technique for extended time in water: lie on your back in a starfish formation, arms spread and legs curled slightly, to conserve energy and survive until a rescue team arrives. Meanwhile, James moved toward the propeller with a knife, attempting to follow this expert advice by using the propeller stand to climb. But the knife slipped from his hands, falling toward the water. He quickly grabbed it but struggled to breathe, and when he pulled himself up, his head struck the heavy propeller, causing a serious injury and internal bleeding. Amy saw blood flowing from his ear, realizing he needed immediate medical attention. James handed the knife to the others, hoping they could use it, but time was running out. Jack quickly grabbed the knife and tried to use it to create a foothold on the boat, unaware that the boat could flood and sink if punctured. Dan rushed to stop him, and a heated argument escalated into a fight between Dan and Jack. Meanwhile, James's condition worsened, and Amy was by his side, trying to help. In the chaos, the knife accidentally pierced Jack's stomach, causing severe bleeding. He was losing strength rapidly, and no medical supplies were available. Dan was shocked, having had no intention of harming Jack. Blood spread into the water, making them even more vulnerable, as predators attracted by the scent could approach at any moment. Panic escalated. The only option was to get everyone out of the water immediately before the situation became fatal. Jack, meanwhile, was with his ex-girlfriend Lauren, confessing that he had always loved her but had made many mistakes while trying to move forward in life, and now was facing the consequences. Michelle, Jack's current girlfriend, was terrified and wanted nothing to do with the group anymore. Exhausted, she began sinking into the water, and although Dan tried to save her, he failed. Michelle was gone. Jack stayed briefly with Lauren, but even she eventually succumbed. Lauren screamed and cried uncontrollably. At this point, only Amy, James, Dan, and Lauren remained alive. From above, Amy could hear the voice of her daughter, Sarah, on the walkie-talkie. She had woken up, and no one was on the upper deck. Amy had to reach her daughter no matter what. James confronted Dan, furious and blaming him for everything that had gone wrong. Dan, shocked, didn't respond, and Amy stepped in, pulling James back, explaining that this wasn't the moment for fighting, they needed to plan a way out. In that moment, James realized that Amy and Dan had been in a relationship years ago, which explained why Amy was protecting him. This revelation devastated James, leaving him in tears. Dan, meanwhile, began crying, realizing the full extent of his mistakes. If he hadn't broken the rules and jumped into the water with Amy, none of this would have happened, and no lives would have been lost. He had only wanted to impress Amy and rekindle their relationship, not realizing she had moved on. Now, with 2 people dead, Michelle and Jack, chaos and despair surrounded the remaining friends. Hours passed in the water, with the scorching sun above and cold sea below, causing dehydration and exhaustion. Sarah's cries on the boat came through the radio, and Amy tried desperately to calm her, but she wouldn't stop. After waiting fruitlessly, Lauren decided to attempt swimming to shore to get help. Despite knowing how dangerous it was, no land was visible anywhere. James's condition worsened, repeatedly losing consciousness, and Amy had to tend to him constantly. Finally, Amy considered Jack's earlier plan, creating a hole in the boat with a knife to climb through and seal it afterward to prevent flooding. However, the knife had fallen to the sea during Dan and Jack's earlier fight, meaning it had to be retrieved from the bottom. Dan immediately volunteered to search for it himself, taking responsibility for the task. With Amy and James left on the boat, James weakened dangerously, needing urgent medical attention, and Amy struggled to keep him stable while planning their next move. If he didn't wake up soon, he probably wouldn't survive. Still, Amy did everything she could to keep him conscious, shaking him, calling his name, refusing to let him slip away. Time passed slowly, each minute feeling heavier than the last. Rain began to pour, and though it drenched them completely, it also brought a small blessing: fresh drinking water. It was pure, something they desperately needed. But as Amy sat beside James, watching his still body, she couldn't believe what was happening. She had never imagined that the man she married, the one she had promised to spend her entire life with, would leave her in such a state. The harsh truth hit her like a wave: James was gone. He was dead. Amy broke down completely, sobbing uncontrollably, refusing to accept the reality before her eyes. She kept whispering his name, begging him to wake up, convincing herself this couldn't be real. But no matter how hard she cried, nothing changed. James was truly gone. Meanwhile, Dan was fighting his own battle. Desperately, he dove into the murky water again and again, searching for the knife that might give them a chance at survival. Hours passed, but the water was too dark, too cloudy, he couldn't see a thing. Exhaustion and frustration started taking over, while Amy sat helplessly, her eyes red from crying. Still, deep inside, she knew she had to move forward, for her daughter's sake. With trembling hands and a shattered heart, Amy finally made the hardest decision of her life. She pushed James's lifeless body away, letting it drift slowly into the distance. Tears streamed down her face as the reality sank in. All she could think now was that she had to save her child, no matter what. But fear began to take over again. Amy didn't know what to do, or how she'd even survive this. Her husband was dead, and she felt the same fate waiting for her and her daughter. The gentle rain soon turned into a violent storm. Giant waves crashed against their boat, and thunder roared through the night sky. Just then, Dan suddenly surfaced from the water, battered, injured, gasping for air. Despite all his efforts, he hadn't found the knife. It seemed their fate was sealed, they might both die out there. Amy rushed to grab him, pulling him toward the boat. Now, they were the only 2 left alive. They didn't even know if Lauren, the one who had gone to seek help, was still alive or not. Reaching the boat, Dan, weak but determined, took off his glasses, gritted his teeth, and began slamming them repeatedly against the boat's surface, trying to puncture a small hole, anything that could help them escape, even without a knife. He hit it again and again, his hands trembling from the effort. But it was useless. The boat wouldn't break. Instead, the sharp edges of the glass cut deeply into his hand, leaving him bleeding and exhausted. That attempt had been useless too. Nothing they tried was working. Amy kept checking every corner of the boat, running her hands along the edges, searching desperately for some weak spot where they could punch through and climb out, but there was nothing. No sign of escape. It was impossible to tell if they would even survive this ordeal. Dan, his hand bleeding from a deep gash, still refused to give up. Gritting his teeth, he snapped his glasses in half, fashioning a jagged, makeshift weapon. Spotting a small, softer section of wood on the boat's interior, he raised the shard high and drove it down with all his strength. The sharp point bit into the wood, cracking it open. Finally, a gap formed. It wasn't big, but it was enough to wedge a grip, enough for them to pull themselves up. Dan immediately called to Amy, who was on the other side. Relief flickered in their eyes. They finally had something to hold on to. Dan explained quickly, his voice urgent over the sound of the storm, "Climb on my shoulders first. Then grab the railing. We'll make it out together." It sounded simple. But when Amy placed her foot on Dan's back and tried to haul herself up, the rain slick would betray her. She slipped again and again, crashing down each time. They tried over and over, their hands raw, their bodies trembling, but nothing worked. Meanwhile, Dan's wound kept tearing open, blood mingling with the rain. Yet he never once told her to stop. He kept steady, whispering her daughter's name, Sarah, reminding Amy what she was fighting for. That single word gave Amy strength. Thinking of her child lit a fire inside her. With a last burst of determination, she tried one more time, pushing past the pain, the fear, the cold. And this time, her hands caught the railing. She clung tightly, hauling herself up as Dan pushed from below. With sheer grit, she climbed over the edge of the boat. Dan, satisfied that she was safe, prepared to follow. At last, it looked like they might survive. Amy's first instinct was to find her daughter. She needed to see Sarah, to make sure she was safe. As she moved toward the cabin, she flipped the switch for the stairs, giving Dan a clear way to climb up behind her. He had a chance now, he could save himself. But instead, Dan hesitated. A storm of thoughts raged inside him. The weight of guilt bore down heavier than the water around him. He thought about all the lives lost, all the people who had died because of his mistakes. He couldn't shake it. Even if he survived, he'd spend the rest of his life drowning in that guilt. In his mind, he didn't deserve to live. So, when the moment came, Dan didn't climb. He let go, slipping back into the water, vanishing beneath the waves. Amy reached her daughter at last, gathering Sarah into her arms, whispering soothing words as she held her close. Relief washed over her. Her little girl was alive. She was safe. Whatever it took, Amy was determined to get her out of there, to give her a future. After a while, Amy began to feel uneasy. Something was wrong. Dan still hadn't climbed back onto the boat. Calling out his name, she stepped toward the edge, scanning the fog-covered water. But there was no sign of him anywhere. Panic started to rise in her chest as she shouted louder and louder for him. Then suddenly, she saw it, Dan's head floating just above the surface. In that instant, Amy realized the horrifying truth: Dan had decided to end his own life. Without a second thought, Amy grabbed an air jacket and threw it toward him, hoping he'd hold on. But from the look of it, it was clear, Dan didn't want to be saved. Slowly, he began sinking beneath the waves. Even though Amy had moved on with her life, memories of the moments she'd shared with Dan flooded her mind. And now, the same Amy who had always been terrified of water, found herself gathering every ounce of courage she had left. Ignoring her fear, she dove straight into the cold, dark water to save him. As she swam, flashes of her past came rushing back, her father teaching her how to swim, his laughter, his encouragement. Even though he was gone now, his words echoed in her head, pushing her forward. "Don't give up, Amy." All she could think about was saving Dan. She reached him just as he was about to sink completely, grabbed hold of him, and somehow pulled him up to the surface. Seeing her drag Dan out of the water, it was clear Amy had conquered her greatest fear. She would never be afraid of swimming again. Soon, dawn broke. A fisherman's boat approached, drifting near theirs. The fisherman looked around for a moment, but seeing no one, he eventually left. Later, we find out that Sarah was crying, while Amy stood silently on the deck, staring at the horizon. Then she turned, and there lay Dan, unconscious but alive. Amy had saved his life. Now, with the boat still intact, they finally had a way to escape. And that's where this painful yet powerful story comes to an end.